1 minute ago, Europe is no longer whispering, it is unravelling in full view. And at the centre of this unfolding crisis lies a document so dense, so technical, and yet so explosively consequential that even seasoned insiders are struggling to contain its implications. Before we roll the footage, just one thing. If you enjoy our work, drop a like and hit subscribe. Over 98% of you are watching without subscribing. Let's change that right now. It's free for you, but it fuels everything we do. Subscribed? Perfect! Now enjoy the video. Okay, because what initially appeared to be a routine €2 trillion budget framework has now been exposed as something far more ambitious and far more dangerous, a structural redesign of power within the European Union that was never meant to be understood by the public in real time. The story did not break with a dramatic announcement or an official briefing, but with a quiet leak that passed through the hands of analysts who were trained to notice inconsistencies. And what they noticed was not a single error, but a pattern, a repetition of clauses and conditions that seemed to redirect authority away from national governments and toward centralised mechanisms that had no direct democratic accountability. And once those patterns were mapped out, the implications became impossible to ignore. Within hours of that discovery, fragments of the document began circulating among a small circle of journalists and policy experts, not as headlines, but as raw excerpts that required interpretation. And as those interpretations emerged, they converged on a single, unsettling conclusion. This was not merely a financial plan. So it was a governance shift disguised as fiscal policy, a way to reshape decision-making authority across the Union without triggering the kind of immediate backlash that a formal treaty change would provoke. The first government to react openly was Italy, and its response was neither cautious nor diplomatic, because officials in Rome recognised immediately that the mechanisms embedded in the framework would fundamentally alter their ability to control domestic spending priorities. And in a statement that reverberated across European media, one senior figure described the proposal as a system of conditional sovereignty, a phrase that captured both the technical nature of the change and the political threat it represented. As that statement spread, major outlets began amplifying the story. And with broadcasters and newspapers attempting to translate the complexity of the document into terms the public could understand, and while the details remained difficult to follow, the core message was clear enough to generate alarm. Under the proposed system, access to critical development funds would no longer be guaranteed by membership alone, but would instead be tied to compliance with a set of policy benchmarks determined at the central level. Those benchmarks, according to the leaked sections, extended beyond purely economic criteria and into areas that have historically been the domain of national governments, including regulatory alignment, environmental targets, and broader social policy frameworks, which meant that funding decisions could effectively become tools of enforcement, rewarding those who aligned with central priorities and penalising those who did not. The reaction to this revelation was immediate and multifaceted, as political leaders across the continent began to recalibrate their positions, some expressing concern in carefully worded statements, while others adopted a far more confrontational tone. And in several cases, long-standing alliances showed signs of strain as governments weighed the benefits of cooperation against the risks of diminished autonomy. At the same time, public response began to take shape in ways that could not be easily managed because the story, once translated into simpler terms, tapped into a broader anxiety about control and representation. And within days, social media platforms were flooded with interpretations, critiques, and increasingly pointed questions about who had authorised such a sweeping transformation and why it had been structured in a way that obscured its true impact. Protests soon followed, initially small but symbolically powerful, as groups that felt directly affected by the proposed changes sought to make their voices heard. And among the most visible were agricultural communities whose concerns were amplified by parallel trade discussions that seemed to threaten their competitiveness, creating a convergence of economic and political grievances that intensified the overall sense of crisis. While these developments were unfolding in public, a more discreet layer of activity was taking place behind the scenes, as reports began to surface of private meetings that had not been listed on official schedules. And although the details of those meetings remain unclear, their existence was confirmed through indirect evidence, including travel records and discrepancies in official timetables that suggested a parallel negotiation process operating outside the usual institutional channels. This discovery added a new dimension to the unfolding narrative, because it implied that while the broader union was grappling with the implications of the leaked framework, a select group of actors might already be shaping its final form through bilateral discussions, raising concerns about transparency and fairness that further eroded trust in the process. Critics were quick to seize on this aspect of the story, arguing that the combination of centralised funding mechanisms and opaque negotiation practices pointed to a deliberate strategy of consolidation, one that relied not on overt coercion, but on the gradual alignment of incentives and pressures. And although these claims remain contested, they have gained traction in an environment where official explanations have struggled to keep pace with emerging revelations. Economic analysts, meanwhile, have focused on the structural implications of the framework, noting that the scale of the proposed budget, combined with its conditional allocation model, would give central institutions an unprecedented degree of influence over regional development trajectories, effectively allowing them to shape investment patterns across multiple sectors and time horizons, a capability that has traditionally been distributed among member states. This concentration of influence has prompted a broader debate about the balance between efficiency and autonomy, and with some experts arguing that a more coordinated approach could enhance overall stability and competitiveness, while others warn that the loss of localised decision-making could undermine responsiveness and democratic legitimacy, particularly in regions with distinct economic and social conditions. As these debates intensify, attention has increasingly turned to specific elements within the framework that appear to carry disproportionate significance, and among them is a single allocation that, while relatively small in numerical terms, has been described by insiders as uniquely consequential due to its strategic positioning within the overall structure. The exact nature of this allocation remains a subject of speculation, but its existence has been confirmed by multiple sources. And its placement suggests that it may serve as a linchpin for broader policy initiatives, linking financial resources to objectives that extend beyond the immediate scope of the budget itself, thereby amplifying its potential impact. The decision to embed such a critical element in a way that makes it difficult to detect without detailed analysis has raised further questions about intent, with some observers interpreting it as evidence of a deliberate effort to minimise scrutiny, while others caution that the complexity of the document may simply reflect the technical challenges of coordinating a budget of this magnitude. Regardless of interpretation, the effect has been the same. A growing sense that the full implications of the framework have yet to be fully revealed, and that additional disclosures could alter the trajectory of the debate in unpredictable ways. This uncertainty has been compounded by the approach of a high-stakes summit at which key decisions are expected to be made, because while official agendas emphasise routine discussions, few observers believe that the underlying tensions can be contained within standard procedural boundaries. And many anticipate that the meeting will serve as a critical juncture in determining whether the framework moves forward in its current form, is significantly revised, or is delayed altogether. In the lead up to that summit, diplomatic activity has intensified, with representatives engaging in a series of consultations aimed at clarifying positions and identifying potential areas of compromise. Yet despite these efforts, the gap between competing perspectives remains substantial, reflecting fundamentally different views about the future direction of the Union and the appropriate balance between collective action and national discretion. Outside the formal negotiation process, the broader environment continues to evolve as market indicators respond to the uncertainty and public discourse becomes increasingly polarised. creating a feedback loop in which political developments influence economic expectations and vice versa, thereby raising the stakes for all parties involved. Amid this complexity, one point of consensus has emerged. The current moment represents more than a technical disagreement over budgetary details because at its core, the debate touches on foundational questions about governance, accountability, and the distribution of authority within a system that has long relied on a delicate equilibrium between unity and diversity. As the situation continues to unfold, observers are left grappling with a series of unresolved questions that will shape the next phase of the crisis, including whether the concerns raised by critics will lead to substantive changes in the framework, whether the apparent divisions among member states will deepen or give way to a negotiated settlement, and whether additional information will come to light that further clarifies or complicates the picture. What remains certain is that the narrative is still developing and that the coming days will be critical in determining not only the fate of the proposed budget, but also the broader trajectory of the European project. Because decisions made in this moment will have lasting implications that extend far beyond the immediate context, influencing how power is exercised and contested for years to come. So the question now is not simply whether this €2 trillion framework will pass, but what it will ultimately represent if it does, a step toward greater cohesion or a shift toward centralised control. And perhaps most importantly, whether those affected by its provisions will feel that they had a meaningful role in shaping its outcome, or whether they will come to see it as something imposed rather than agreed. And as the summit approaches and the pressure continues to build, one final question lingers above all others. What else remains hidden within the pages of a document that has already revealed so much? And what will happen when those remaining details are brought into the light? Stay with this story because the next revelation may not just change the conversation, it may redefine it entirely. And if you want to understand what comes next before the rest of the world catches up, now is the moment to stay informed, stay engaged, and be ready for what is about.